Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening for our second event in the Border Literatures series. Border Literatures is a book reading and conversation series co-curated by Professor Nicholas Allen and the National Library of Ireland, seeking to explore borders in literature. Today is our first conversation and reading-based event, and our panel will be discussing the Death at Whitewater Church by Andrea Carter, which is the first in the Inishowen mystery series. Our panel this evening consists of Liam McIlvanney, Neil Hegarty, and Elizabeth Beth Mannion. So I will be passing over shortly to our moderator, Liam McIlvanney. Liam was born in Scotland and studied at the universities of Glasgow and Oxford. He has written for numerous publications, including the London Review Books and the Times Literary Supplement and The Guardian. His debut, Burns the Radical, won the Saltire First Book Award, and Where the Dead Men Go won the Niall Marsh Award for Best Crime Novel. His most recent book, The Quaker, won the 2018 McIlvanney Prize for Scottish Crime Book of the Year, and he is the Stewart Professor of Scottish Studies at University of Otago, New Zealand. And we're very grateful to Liam for joining us at this extraordinary time difference as well. So thank you everyone for joining us. We look forward to the conversation this evening. If you have got any questions for our panelists, please feel free to pop them into the Q&A function, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to those questions towards the end of our panel tonight. So with further ado, I hand you over, and thank you very much everyone for joining us.
Thanks very much indeed. Well, kia ora, fescar ma, good evening and welcome to this online session in the National Library of Ireland's Border Literatures series. My name's Liam McIlvanney. I'm a crime writer and academic based in New Zealand. I should perhaps point out that it's just after 7 o'clock in the morning here in New Zealand, so I may be making even less sense than I normally do. Also, if scenes of domestic mayhem unfold behind me with kids getting ready for school and so on, we can just ignore that. So it's my great pleasure to chair this session on the first book in Andrea Carter's great Inishowen Mysteries series, Death at Whitewater Church. For this evening's event, I'm delighted to be joined by Neil Hegarty and Elizabeth Manion. Neil Hegarty grew up in Derry. His novels include The Jewel, published in 2019, and Inch Levels, which was shortlisted for the Kerry Group Novel of the Year Awards in 2017. He's also the author of Frost, That Was the Life That Was, a biography of David Frost, and The Story of Ireland, which accompanies a BBC RTE television history of Ireland. His essays and short fiction have appeared in the Dublin Review, Stinging Fly, and Tangerine. He reviews for the Irish Times and the Dublin Review of Books, and he lives in Dublin. Elizabeth Mannion's research focuses on theatre and an interdisciplinary range of Irish studies, from revivalist drama to contemporary crime fiction. She's the co-editor with Brian Cliff of the Edgar Award-nominated Guilt Rules All, Irish Mystery, Detective and Crime Fiction 2020, editor of A Contemporary Irish Detective Novel 2016, and author of The Urban Plays of the Early Abbey Theatre 2014. Beth teaches at the City University of New York and is currently working on a book that examines the theatre of Wallace Shawn. So just a quick word about the format for this session. It's an hour-long session. I'll chat with Neil and Beth for around 40 minutes before throwing it open to questions from the floor. So if you could ask your questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, that would be fantastic. Okay, let's get started. We're looking then at Death at Whitewater Church. When a skeleton is discovered wrapped in a blanket in the hidden crypt of a deconsecrated church, everyone is convinced that the bones must be those of Connor Devitt, a local man who went missing on his wedding day 6 years previously. But the post-mortem reveals otherwise. Local solicitor Benedicta O'Keefe, our narrator and protagonist, is drawn into the mystery, uncovering layers of personal and political history to get to the truth of what happened. Now, we'll look at the novel in just a moment, but let's begin by taking a little step back. And Neil, if I could begin with you, as someone who knows the terrain and topography of Inishowen, perhaps you could kick things off, Neil, by giving us the lay of the land and talking a bit about how the border impacts on people's daily lives in that part of the world.
Well, if you imagine one of those strange maps that sometimes pops up of Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, with Northern Ireland sliced off. You see Donegal attached tenuously to the rest of the state. And then you see Inishowen attached tenuously to the rest of Donegal. And it's surrounded on three sides by water. And of course, the clue is in the name, Inishowen, and Inish means island. And then on the south side of the peninsula runs the Irish border, and then on the other side of the border is Derry City, with which Inishowen shares very close, very intense social, family, human, educational, even ecclesiastical bonds. The best way to imagine it is two hemispheres which click together to make one whole. And of course, it means that the border is an intrinsic and an intense part of life in that part of the world. There's no getting away from it, and yet you have to live with it. You have to cross it over and over and over again. I would just add a little PS to that Andrea Carter sets a crucial part of the book on Lough Foyle, which of course washes the eastern shore of Inishowen, and Lough Foyle is that very strange place. It doesn't legally belong at the moment to either the UK or to Ireland. The border hasn't been properly demarcated in the waters of the loch, so that in Derry it's referred to as more or less free for all. People call it the Klondike down there, where anything goes. So a very strange place, a very strange body of water. And that's where Andrea Carter has chosen to set this book and her whole sequence of Inishowen mysteries in this very debatable land.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned the importance of water there, Neil. I noticed there was a letter in the Irish Times last week pointing out that, or arguing that the waters around the entire island, that the sovereignty of the waters is held by the Republic. So that, you know, the very focus on water brings in these questions of jurisdictions and borders and demarcations. Beth, if I could ask you, one of the intriguing things to my mind about the depiction of Inishowen in the novel is the way that Carter quite seamlessly blends real places, Derry, Malin Head, Buncrana, with fictional places, Whitewater, Glendara. Perhaps inevitably in relation to the fictional Glendara, we think of Melville's great line, "It is not down on any map, true places never are." What effects do you think Andrea Carter achieves, Beth, through this blending of fictional and real places in the book?
I think it manages to do what great historical fiction has always done for me, whether it's mystery-based or not, which is it keeps you off balance in one respect, but in the other, it always reminds me of how fluid fact and fiction really are. So I actually, it's a quality of the novel, one of many that I really loved. And it also kind of parallels the fluidity that the main character is, that Ben is. You know, she, I don't remember there being very many conversations, if any, in the novel where the border is actually addressed. I remember there's this one scene where she's going to Derry with her friend to go to the theater, and they cross the Peace Bridge, or she sees the Peace Bridge. And apart from that, I don't remember the border ever being really directly addressed. So again, she's sort of, because she is, you know, she's come as far in Ireland as she can to get away from Dublin. She's sort of carrying the border with her in a way, which is also a fluidity that kind of reflects the water and the setting.
Mm. Yeah, you've got that sense of almost crossing the borders between reality and fiction in the book. And I think you're right, Beth, that, you know, the border is not addressed, I suppose, with the explicitness that it might be in, for instance, Brian McGilloway's Inspector Devlin novels, where you do get that, you know, the jurisdictional tensions and collaborations between the Guards and the RUC in the early books and the PSNI in the later ones. And I suppose that partly reflects the decision to focus on a solicitor as our central character. What do we feel about the slightly unusual investigator in this book? What is Benedicta O'Keeffe's job as a local solicitor bring to the table, do we feel?
Is that to me? She brings a lot. I mean, it's a great technique that Carter uses to have it be a first-person narration and have that first-person narrator be somebody who, while she is a local, she's a transplant. She's only lived there for, I think, was it about 6 years. She comes there shortly after, I guess, the murder of, or the disappearance of Connor Devitt. And so, in a way, we get to see everything in the same pace that she sees it. So it's a great way of pacing the plot. I love that. And the fact that she's a solicitor who serves the community as a whole, she doesn't specialize in, you know, in criminal or in this or in that, gives her an opportunity to interact with the full scope of the community.
And she's because she's a solicitor, she's a keeper of secrets. People have to go to her, people have to tell her their private business. And she's relied upon not to be a gossip, not to go off telling everybody this and that. And yet at the same time, she knows, and we know, and the town knows, that she will always be an outsider. It seems to me that Andrea Carter shows quite a strong emotional intelligence in the way that she builds this character, because she's Ben O'Keeffe is absolutely clear-sighted about her role, and she knows that she can, even if she wanted to, she would never be fully accepted by this town that she's tried to graft herself onto.
Mm. And that's quite a sort of long-standing trope in Irish fiction, isn't it? The sort of outsider protagonist who comes into an area and learns about its customs and manners and so forth. But traditionally, of course, this has been an English incomer. If you think right back to books like Sidney Owenson's The Wild Irish Girl in 1806, and Walter Scott, of course, does something similar in Waverley by having the Englishman Edward Waverley come into the Highlands at the time of the Jacobite Rising. So it's quite an interesting spin, to my mind, on this trope, to have the outsider figure, someone coming from Dublin rather from across the water. What's the significance of this, Neil, in relation to the treatment of Dublin in the book?
I think it's very interesting, and I think that Carter does a very amusing, very sly take on this. We in a way, the media and politics and everything else kind of teaches us that there's a center and there's a periphery, and it's only when we think about it that we realize, well, actually no. In this book, certainly that whole idea, that world is turned on its head. All the way through, it's Dublin that stands as a place that's very remote, that's very far away, that's very hard to get to. But more than that nobody really wants to go there, especially Ben. She would do anything not to go to Dublin. Instead, she preferred to stay in this place, and she's surrounded by a whole community of people who would also rather stay in this place, secure in the knowledge that they have a full set of services, they have everything that they need in this place. So you come away thinking, okay, I think I understand what's going on here. What does remote mean? Who's to say that this place, this town in Donegal, that everyone thinks, oh, it's so far away. Well, from where? From where is it far away from? It isn't far away from itself. And that's the crucial point. So it's a very, very smart move.
Yeah, and even when we get to Dublin in the book, Dublin is treated very sketchily. We don't get the lingering descriptions of the topography and terrain and the weather that we get in relation to Inishowen. One of the other things that intrigued me, just when you're discussing that question of centres and peripheries, is the extent to which a lot is made of the fact that Benedict O'Keeffe runs the most northerly solicitor's office in Ireland. You know, the last legal advice before Iceland, I think, is the sort of strap line. But of course, she's in the south. So I think, you know, are we getting a sort of deliberate confusion of those familiar north and south binaries here?
I think definitely. I think she sort of ironizes that all the way through. She's always going south into the north. She's always heading to Derry and heading back again. And it connects, I think, with a very strong sense in the book that as Beth has noted, the border isn't really mentioned very much. It's both present and absent at the same time. You can't ignore the fact that it's there, that it's an entity, it's a fact, but you absolutely can't allow it to interfere with the way you live your life. It's interesting, of course, that this book is written and is set at a time when that was, I suppose, at its most possible. The troubles are over in inverted commas. The security apparatus is gone. And Brexit hasn't yet made its sort of malign appearance on the horizon. So people aren't really talking about the border. I sort of wonder if Andrea Carter could write that book today with the same sense of relaxation of the border as a presence, as an entity.
Do you?
Yeah, everything's. Sorry, Beth, carry on.
I'm sorry. I was just wondering. This is actually for both of you. The border that I saw most pronounced or most discussed by characters in the novel is an economic border, and I hadn't thought of it before. But what you were just saying, Neil, about Dublin has me thinking that that's sort of a connection to the economic border that gets mentioned so frequently, because when it is brought up, it tends to be in the context of the Celtic Tiger, right? The real estate purchase was made at the height of the market, and they're kind of stuck with it because the market tanked, right, when the tiger fell. And I wonder if there isn't a connection there between, you know, Dublin being so far away and, you know, almost good riddance to it, because it is sort of, to go back to your center and periphery point, the center, right, of the Celtic Tiger years. I don't know. Did you see an economic border sort of more pronounced than a political one in the novel?
It's a funny thing. When I read the book, I very much see myself there because as Liam said, I know that part of the world very, very well. I can sort of understand, I can appreciate the sense that when people talk about the Celtic Tiger, it never really impacted very much on that part of the world. Of course, you know, property prices went up and so on, but it never had the boom that some other parts of Ireland did, and it never really had to bust out either. It just carried on. So that, in a sense, it is an economy in and of itself, quite far removed from the national economy, and it, in a way, it still is that today. It's an interesting other layer of identity going on in the book, for sure. I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, also I think, you know, you mentioned the extent to which the border is rather more fraught these days, Neil, than it was. I suppose the other thing that's in the news in relation to Donegal is these issues of development and the kind of problems with housing and mica and so on. And I suppose that reinforces the sense that people in Donegal sometimes have that they are a kind of forgotten, sort of cut off part of the country. Inishowen is an easy place to lose yourself, to cut yourself off from the rest of the world, as Ben puts it. One of the other features of the sort of rendering of place in the novel that's very striking is simply the weather. I mean, okay, it's set in Donegal in February, so the weather's going to be quite important. But you know, every page has leaden skies and howling winds and sleet and snow and storms sending the Atlantic crashing against the cliffs. Do you feel, Beth, that the weather is more than just the backdrop in this novel, that it plays a slightly more active role in the book.
I do. It's key to a lot of character, certainly with Ben. I think the opening lines, I have to check. Doesn't the book open with her saying how much, or commenting on the weather? The wind was bitter, there was snow in the air. And it gets into later on in 2 or 3 different instances where she makes a point of saying how much she loves storms, she loves violent weather. And to me, part of that is the realism of the piece. As somebody who grew up near the sea, you're a little obsessed with it, and it's very hard. I think, Neil, you might agree, it's very hard to sort of separate your mood from the weather. They impact each other. The weather impacts your day-to-day life, but it also is used in the few instances where there's some outright comedy in the novel, or at least it's sort of tongue-in-cheek. I'm thinking of the character, what's her name, Lisa, who is constantly described as being cold. Even when Ben goes into her house, suddenly the temperature has dropped considerably, and then Ben herself, gets warm when she's around other characters. She is drawn to the ocean and to going for swims when it's most cold and violent out, which is a great technique for giving us insight into her character. She has left a trauma behind in Dublin, and it's still working its way through her. So the fact that she loves violent weather so much makes perfect sense. In a way, it's a really clever device, I think, that Carter uses with her. And then the characters who are secondary, there tends to not be as much of a storm and that sort of thing, or I should say a reaction to it on the part of some of the other characters. I think her name is Phyllis. Always blows the weather off. She can't be bothered to even talk about it. So I think weather is used to not only accentuate character, but also to show us internal workings of some of them.
Yeah,
sorry.
No, as I was reading it, I was thinking, is there a touch of the sort of pathetic fallacy here? And perhaps there is a little bit, but ultimately, it does come down to the fact that Carter is a realist, is a realist writer, and it seemed to me that she was stating and restating that this is a very elemental part of the world. It actually is like this up here. The weather is extreme here. Now do you understand why Ben is here, why she wanted to be so far away, and why she herself is absolutely in her element in this quite violent part of the world in meteorological terms.
Yeah, I suppose the other aspect of that sort of elemental dimension of the importance of the sea that's everywhere in the book. I mean, we've spoken about the border dividing patches of land or of territory. Is it worth thinking about the sea as an element that also unites disparate patches of land? I mean, growing up in the west of Scotland, I was always very conscious that on a clear day you can see from the Ayrshire coast not only Arran and the Cumbries and Bute and the Cowell Peninsula and so on, but Ireland. You can see the Antrim coast. It's only 12 miles distant from the closest point. So I mean, is there any sense of that sort of what we might call the kind of Dalriada perspective of that northeast corner of Ireland and the southwest corner of Scotland being joined in Carter's fiction?
Yeah, I think so. On the northeast coast of Inishowen, where, as it happens, Andrea Carter sets her village of Whitewater. If you stand on any point of that coast, on the beach, on the headlands, you look east, you see Kintyre. You look north and you see Islay and Jura, and it's always a very stirring sight to see these islands and this other island just on the edge of sight on any reasonably clear day. And it is a good reminder that it refers back, I think, to what we were saying earlier, that in that part of the world, the sea has always knit communities together. It has never really divided them. And that's the same today. The economic and the human ties are still very, very strong. So that again, you get a sense of this place as being comprised of a series of different identities. There's a national identity, even though Dublin is, as we said, so far away, so far away. But there's a cross-border identity, strong with Derry. And then there's a long-standing identity, a connection with Scotland, which everybody understands and everybody can see if they just go to the coast. If they go to this place called Whitewater and look out, there it is, some other connection.
Yeah, and I remember doing that actually in County Antrim, sort of looking back to Scotland on a clear day and thinking, this is the only spot on the planet where you can see Scotland from the outside, as it were. But the other thing that reinforced that perspective for me was the language in the book and the use of a sort of vernacular idiom that I would have considered Scots. Halfway down, he shoved the torch under his oxter, a classic West of Scotland word for me. He went down on his hunkers, sure I'm in Egypt. And it reminded me of Seamus Heaney's essay on Robert Burns, where he talks of Scots being understood north of a line between Berwick and Bundoran, which I thought was rather to the point here. What do we think, Beth, about how, what effects does Carter achieve through this use of a kind of vernacular idiom? Was that something that struck you about the book?
The vernacular idiom would have gone right over my head. I have to be perfectly honest with you, as a girl from the Jersey Shore. I would have missed that entirely. But what I did definitely notice is that the language is sort of one element of the respectfulness that she shows her characters. I saw that one of the questions to think about tonight was the degree to which, community, the way she guides the reader toward borders within the society. And I think one of the key ways she does that is through language. People do not speak down to each other. They don't speak up to each other. There's a real, again, sort of adding to the realism of the novel that I loved. Characters are treated respectfully. There's a great deal of balance. There's not a lot of melodrama or high drama going on here. When there are little moments of melodrama, it tends to be within the characters who, are sort of bordering on femme fatale figures, and so it makes sense there. It fits there. But generally speaking, people are the dialogue throughout the entire novel is it operates on an even keel. Do you know what I mean? It's not overly dramatic, and it's not in any way, even with the characters who are viewed as with sympathy, like Danny Devitt perhaps. Even with them, the other characters, when they're talking about him, they never fall into cliche ever. It's one of the things I really enjoyed.
That's right, yeah, because even there's no sort of stock characters or caricatures, even among the minor characters in the book. There's always that suggestion of a kind of hinterland, I think. Perhaps we could begin to shift the discussion to this question of genre, which often comes up in relation to crime fiction. And Andrea Carter herself has spoken about the influence of the Golden Age detective novel on her own work. And we might argue that we see that even in the title, Death at Whitewater Church, like Murder at the Vicarage, with again the same implied tension between the stark fact of murder and the sort of innocuous setting. What do we feel that Death in Whitewater Church owes to the Golden Age tradition, if anything?
I think you can see the lineage, where for example, Agatha Christie gathered people around the vicarage, gathered them in St Mary Mead and set Miss Marvel to work, or Harriet Vane finds herself inside the cloisters of an Oxford college in Gaudy Night. So Andrea Carter brings her characters within a kind of a membrane in this small town, and this small town has everything that you need in order to make the plot work. and everybody knows, she knows, the writer knows, we know, the readers know that there is a murderer here, that somebody or some people are telling lies, but the justice will be done in the end. So we all know the rules. The situation is very, very different from those golden age books, but the rules stay the same, and the sense of I don't know if coziness is the right word, but a sense of everybody gathered together in a room, or in this case in a town, and everything is going to work out in the end. We all know that. Now let's read on.
Must be the coldest cozy in
Yeah.
history. But sorry, Beth, you were going to come in there.
I was thinking while Neil was talking that there's also sort of this Christie-like series of locked rooms in the story. It's almost a frame tale, you know, with the outer frame being, you know, whatever happened to Connor, where did he go? And then within that, because so many of these characters are sort of locked in themselves, there's almost a series of other internal narratives to that frame, of which the mystery of the body is just one, really, you know, or you can read the outer frame as the mystery of the body, and then, you know, we just move Connor into one of these little inside squares. But that has a real cozy-ish quality to it for me. I love locked room mysteries, so that definitely appealed to me.
And perhaps I could just add something else to that in her later books in this series, Carter, she moves from that sense of you could say coziness, or certainly confinement, into claustrophobia. She moves in one of the books. She moves some of the book from Inishowen to an island off Inishowen. So it's even more confined and even more claustrophobic. And in another book, back in Glendara, the town has been cut off by a flood, so that for most of the book, nobody can get in and nobody can get out. So that membrane that I spoke about is absolutely, at that point, is absolutely sealed. There's no getting in until they find out who done it.
Yeah, you very much that sense almost about a kind of locked room mystery, as Beth suggests. I suppose for me, the golden age feature that stood out for me was just this question of community, and the extent to which you know, we get the drama group meeting in the village hall, we get the bookshop run by Phyllis Kettle, and the Oak pub run by Tony Craig. We've got the character Hal McKinney, who's typically not just the undertaker, but the mechanic and a commissioner for oaths and so on. So you do get this sense very much of a vibrant, quite self-enclosed community that's quite typical of the golden age. What does it mean, though, to set a golden age detective novel in an Irish border town? I mean, is the software compatible with the hardware, so to speak? Does it change the golden age form to set it in this kind of milieu, do we feel?
Well, I think Andrea Carter herself said somewhere that the idea, strictly speaking, shouldn't work, that you can't have a crime taking place in a small Irish town without everybody knowing instantly who the criminal was, who the murderer was. You can't keep secrets. You can't commit crimes without everybody knowing about it instantly. So that's one way of looking at it.
Yeah, I suppose the other genre that springs to mind for me when reading the book is the Gothic. The fact that we not only have this ruined church at the heart of the book, complete with the grisly find in the crypt, we've also got that sort of supernatural ambience in the novel, and we've got that Gothic trope of, you know, the past coming back to haunt the present, the kind of dead hand of the past still impacting on the present. And of course, that, you know, right back to the start of crime fiction with Edgar Allan Poe, you've got that, you know, the detective story and the Gothic novels sort of bleeding into one another, if you like. Do you think, Beth, that Carter is attempting something similar here?
I don't know if it was her intent or not. I have many questions I want to ask her, actually. I'm hoping there's a chance to do that. But I would go back not so much to Poes, to Sheridan Le Fanu, who really kind of mixed up the Gothic and the mystery in a sort of trippy way. And we see a thread of that all through a whole bunch of Irish crime writing, really. But intent or not, it's all over the place here. In the examples that you gave, but also, again, I go back to character here. With the character of Connor, he haunts the town. We don't know if he's dead or not, so there's this very ghostly quality that is both literal and figurative. And then I think also the lovely, I don't know, I just found it really beautiful that the bones were found on a pillow and with a blanket over them. Also sort of problematizes the living and the dead in a way that can be considered, I think, Gothic. It works. And I think the Gothic elements always work when you have a small town setting or particularly a remote setting, as we do here. And then there's also, that other element. You said something earlier, Neil, I meant to ask you about it. You were talking about the ecclesiastic bond from one side of the border to another. And the fact that the ruined house on the hill, in this instance, is a ruined church on a hill, is sort of interesting to a Gothic aspect too. And, we have some characters. One of them had been a nun. Do I remember that correctly? One of the characters had been a nun, and she now, I think it was the pharmacist, had been a nun. And so we've got this religious and secular sort of, binding together and moving around each other. So for me, the Gothic element is strong here.
That, I mean, just on the topic of the religious dimension, Beth, I think partly because of the title of the book and the fact that we open with this sort of Gothic ruined church, and indeed the sort of religious symbolism on the opening page, 3 o'clock in the afternoon and the light was fading already. You think, okay, here we go. Here's the religious symbolism coming in. This is going to sort of mount a sort of critique of the institutional church. And to my mind, that was to some extent the dog that didn't bark in the night here, that the church was a surprising almost lacuna in the book. I don't know if the pair of you felt that too.
Yeah, and I think it comes down again to Carter's realism. So while it's all well and good to have Agatha Christie, sprinkle rectors and vicars and bishops all through her books, it wouldn't really wash at this point. It would feel odd. It wouldn't feel realistic to have a priest popping up here and a priest popping up there, given the decline of the church as an institution in modern Ireland. It seems to me when I noticed that and I was thinking about that, it would have struck a kind of weirdly discordant note. And I must say I'm glad she didn't. I'm glad Carter didn't go down that road.
Well, again, she has this wonderful tendency to avoid any kind of cliche, doesn't she? And I think to bring it in would have been going in that direction.
Yeah, the priest could have ended up as a sort of comic character, and probably a really irritating comic character. So you go, phew, I'm glad that didn't happen.
Dodge that bullet. Yeah. Another thing I wanted to raise with you both was this question of the treatment of the Troubles in the book. And I suppose if you think of Irish, particularly Northern Irish crime fiction over the past sort of 15 years or so, you've got a sort of new generation of crime writers tackling the Troubles and its legacy in quite a head-on sort of fashion. I'm thinking of Adrian McKinty's great Sean Duffy books, or Stuart Neville's The 12, his debut that focused on an IRA hitman. How do you feel Andrea Carter's treatment of the Troubles sort of differs from from writers like Neville and McKenty?
I think she handles it in a very interesting and distinctive way. I remember clearly when I first read this book, when I read it for the first time, I was so struck by her use of an actual element from the Troubles, the hijacking and sinking of a coal boat in LEM in Lough Foyle in 1981, which at the time was sensational. The IRA did lots of weird stuff, but they really didn't go in for hijacking ships very much. And I thought, oh, she's using this. This is so interesting. But it's clear in the book, well, even in the way that she handles that hijacking, it's right out in the center of the water. We're not taken out there. It's viewed from afar. It's described from afar. And in other words, we're kept at arm's length. And it seems to me that Carter isn't interested in the intricacies per se of, say, violent crime. She's a lot more interested in the human results of that, like, you know, the ripples and the repercussions. So that we learn in this book that the village of Whitewater, which from where the hijackers went out to get the boat, couldn't survive what happened, and now it's deserted. So it seems to me that she is more interested in the damage to people's psyches, to their relationships, and so on and so on. And that struck a chord with me, because even though Northern Ireland is in the news all the time, those human consequences of the Troubles don't get nearly as much attention as they ought to get. It's known, it's well known inside Northern Ireland. It isn't very well known outside Northern Ireland that Northern Ireland is one of the most heavily medicated parts of the world, because people are still dealing with the consequences of trauma. We're still dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, which has never been properly addressed. If you like, it's never been aired, and it probably isn't going to be aired in the years to come. So instead, people just take pills and try to get on, even though many lives have been ruined. And I think, sorry, Beth.
I'm sorry, continue. I cut you off. Do you think that the fact that it was witnessed from afar, specifically by a child, ties in with the realism and this idea of trauma that will go on?
That will go on and on, yeah, for sure. You can't talk about it very much. You have to keep it a secret. You have to bury it, and that's what happens in this book. Lots of stuff is kept under wraps, and it causes damage, and it causes damage, and it keeps on causing damage. It's one of the most powerful elements in the book, it seems to me.
There's also that interesting connection. The mother, it's a blink and you miss it moment, but we find out that Mrs. Devitt, that her husband, who primarily is discussed in the novel as having died by suicide as a result of the Sadie bombing, was also an abuser. She makes this point of saying, you know, I know what an abusive man is. I lived with one for 15 years and tried to hide the scars of it. So that's almost, again, you know, she's constantly referred to as, you know, a very stoic woman, a survivor and all of this. But she's covered up, right? A domestic tragedy, just like these other characters are living with and keeping down the trauma of what they witnessed, which is connected to the Troubles. But it never becomes a Troubles novel, does it?
No, everything, if you like, everything stems from the Troubles, so that it's fundamentally all about the Troubles. It's just that we mustn't talk about the Troubles, because that would be disturbing to the social calm. So let's just move on, in the same way as let's not talk about any abuse carrying on in somebody's household. Just keep calm and carry on, even though that doesn't work.
And yet the drama group, so this one organization that's all about performing, when they're trying to pick their play for the new season, they decide to go with the Troubles play as long as it has some comedy in it.
Yeah.
Right? Which came out of nowhere. And I'm dying to ask her how she came up with the titles for those plays. I'm going to repeat that again.
Perhaps we can.
I hope so. I hope so. She's here.
Okay, well, I think we're approaching the time when we should open the discussion up to the wider participants. And I see in my little Q&A function at the bottom of the screen here that Joan Boyd has posed a question to our panelists. So I'll just read this out to you. So Joan asks, I wonder to what extent you feel that Benedicta's secret about her sister affects her ability to understand better those other characters who are also harbouring secrets. And do you think the revelations at the end and the uncovering of some very terrible secrets will help her to deal with the secret she has withheld from her parents? So Beth, do you want to tackle that?
I'm reading it also. You know, I can't remember any points in the story, Joan, where she makes the connection directly between another family's struggles like the Devitts and her own. But I'm inclined to say that maybe it prevents her from understanding the characters around her who do the things they do. Except there's this one line I remember her saying, and I can't remember exactly where it is in the action, but I think it's when she's in that cold house with that cold woman, where she talks about this fine line between love and hate being connected to emotions of guilt. And then after she unburdens herself with Malloy and tells him about her past, he kind of throws that same line at her and says, you know, if you remain quiet and if you hold on to things like this, including guilt, it's going to eat away at you. And so I kind of, going back to the weather for a second again, when she goes into those cold swims, she tells us that it's something her dad used to do and her granddad used to do. So it's like a way for her to connect to her family when she doesn't visit them for a long time. But I also noticed that she tends to do it. I think there's only 2 instances, but in both instances, she does it when her head is just, when sort of her past is closing in on her. And her past, to your point, Joan, tends to close in on her when there's a lot of clutter and noise about the mystery, you know, going on. So I guess I'm answering it 2 different ways. I think it helps her, but I think it also hinders her.
Thanks, Beth. I suppose, Neil, I mean, you know, one of the things, just touching on that I found very rewarding about the book was this sense of our central character as this slightly wounded figure with her own hinterland and her own secrets and her own experience of trauma. And I think that, you know, gave her a sense of, you know, perhaps personal investment in getting to the root of some of the issues that are raised by the book. So you know, do you feel that her own trauma gives her a sense of empathy or an ability to sort of sympathize with the other characters in the book?
I think it depends. I think she's a very good observer. I think she's a very good reader of the characters she sees around her, and she's in her element. That word again, when she can sit back and she can watch. I don't always think that she's very sympathetic. I don't think she's always a very empathetic character. I think she reads people. To use Beth's words, she can read people quite coldly, and there can be a touch of judgment from time to time. Actually, I think especially other women, especially if they're on the glamorous side, she's very aware of that. She doesn't want to be glamorous, but she's I don't think she's necessarily very pleased when other women are glamorous. So she isn't that empathetic. She's just a really excellent watcher and reader of people.
You mentioned earlier, Beth, the question of sort of femme fatale in the book, and I suppose that raises this whole issue of, you know, the sort of noir influence on the novel. Could you maybe just expand a little on what you were driving at there?
I purposely didn't read the others. I have them here. I got all of them at once, but I didn't want to read the rest of the series because I was afraid I would confuse plot points today. So I only read the first one so far. But what I'm curious to know when I get to them is the extent to which the femme fatale figure carries over into the other stories. For this reason, and kind of tying into what you were just saying, Neil, about her coldness and how she views women who have a bit of glamour to them. So we've got in this story, Lisa and is it Allison? Is that the other woman? Who both are commented upon for, you know, being pulled together, maybe dressing in an expensive way, this sort of thing, wearing a lot of makeup. And these are two of the characters that tend to have femme fatale characteristics, you know. And the roots of noir, right? You need to have the femme fatale figure. You need to have cynicism. You usually had an urban setting, and these things have all evolved, right, over time. Thank goodness. The femme fatale figure isn't necessarily always of a female gender anymore. The cynicism can exist in a small town as much as it can exist in a city, certainly. But one of the things I'm curious to see is the extent to which Ben will adopt some of these femme fatale qualities herself. And the reason I'm curious about that is because there's also this line in the story where she says something along she's commenting on one of them. I can't remember which one it is. And then that sort of dovetails into her contemplating warmth. Again, always the cold and the warm. And then that moves into this line. I wish I marked it out. Where she says something like, you know, she still has some heat, but it's lying dormant, you know, and I'm assuming she's going to become, she's going to return to having some kind of an active sex life as things move along, because she makes a point of saying that that's been dormant. All of anything in her that could run hot, it's still in there. But it's sleeping, you know, while she works through the guilt and the trauma of what happened to her sister. And so I tend to think that her view of these other women is at least partly a disdain or a discomfort because she knows she herself has been living in a cold fashion for a number of years, you know. But and also the cynicism part of noir is really tempered here, which I like. Again, sort of going to Carter's realism, which I really appreciate. That we all have some degree of cynicism in us, but none of these characters seem to, maybe with the exception of Connor, in the end, have let it dominate their lives. You know?
Yeah, and it is one of the satisfactions of the series that we can follow how Ben evolves as a character and how her life starts to expand as the book goes on. Those elements of romance and love and sex and other things, they do gradually begin to get a look in, and that's very satisfying.
In fact, we have another question touching on this from Anne Alcorn, who writes, if I missed this in your discussion, I apologise. What was the subject of romance discussed? It appears that the relationship between Ben and the guard, I forget his name, Malloy, is in its early stages. Do you think it might be romantic? Will he be the vehicle to anchor her in the town, or any thoughts you may have? So will Malloy replace Guinness the cat in Ben's affections?
Will he or won't he? We shall have to read on and find out. Let's say he's quite a substantial character as the sequence goes on. We can't give too much away, can we?
Yeah,
I'll be able to answer that by the weekend, but right now I don't know the answer.
I do.
That's right. Read the rest of the series to find out, Anne, I think is the message there.
Yeah.
We also have another question from Rosalind Blinn. Do we have any admittedly sweeping generalisations about what makes Irish crime fiction Irish? Scottish crime fiction Scottish, American crime fiction American, and English crime fiction English. English aside from tea, crumpets, and corpses in picturesque libraries, etc. Thanks very much for that question, Roslyn. So, Beth, do you want to have a go at answering that?
Okay. I don't think there's any one thing that makes any of these different national crime fictions. There's certain conventions that exist, but they're not all that different than the conventions that exist in any of the subgenres of crime writing, really. I don't think. Setting, I guess, is the most obvious one, but some of our greatest Irish crime writers don't limit the settings of all of their novels to Ireland, you know. And so it tends to be reference points. Certainly with American crime writing, it's either a historical or a cultural reference point. And I think that's the same for a lot of the other ones that you mentioned there.
Neil, what are your thoughts?
I meant, well, and in the Irish context, I suppose I'm interested in the presence of secrets, perhaps open secrets and lies. Perhaps an idea of open endings, and of the need to see justice served in a kind of cloudy, difficult political context, but it may not always happen. You're not always going to see those happy endings that we spoke of before. I've been reading Anthony J. Quinn's Border novels set in the North, and there's very little sense of happy endings in any of those. He continues to be bowed down. He continues to be clouded by the legacy of his life and his environment. And although you can wish this guy Celsius Daly well, you sort of think it probably isn't going to be so well and so happy for him. So that's a very interesting element, I think.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it? I mean, I suppose in the Scottish context, you tend to think of perhaps some of the big sort of social and sort of historical influences. So something like Calvinism, with its emphasis on, I suppose, the appearance of respectability that perhaps is a facade for sort of nefarious sin and corruption underneath, the kind of Jekyll and Hyde thing. That sort of duality seems to run right through Scottish crime fiction. And I suppose you also have, you know, we tend to think of crime fiction as sort of beginning with a kind of big bang with Edgar Allan Poe. But of course, you know, I think in the Scottish and the Irish context, you've got that whole longer Gothic tradition that very often sort of feeds into the later crime writing. One of the questions that I had on a more sort of general level about Irish crime fiction, which is probably similarly difficult to answer, just the sense that Irish crime fiction is enjoying a great vogue at the moment. So if we think of, you know, the Theakston's Prize, even the big sort of UK and Irish prize, is sort of being dominated by Irish writers over the past few years. Steve Kavanagh won it 3 years ago, then Adrian McKinty, and this year Brian McGilloway got an honourable mention. What's behind this sort of rise in the popularity of Irish crime fiction, do we think?
I have a sense that it has to do with Ireland being such a society in flux, because there have been so many social changes packed into the last 20 years. And that brings with it a release of energy, but also a kind of a sense of chaos too. Where are the pieces going to fall? Everything's up in the air. What new patterns are going to emerge? And there's a sense of, if you like, disorder too. And in the midst of disorder, crime flourishes, and that means that crime writing flourishes. It's another way to try to make sense of what might otherwise be very, very difficult change for a lot of people. I think that readers want to see reflected on the page this sense that they might feel in their own lives, that society is changing very, very fast. They want that sort of mirror held up in books too, so that they can begin to make sense of it. I have some sense that it has to do with that.
I would tack onto that too, similarly, but from a different side, is there's a nimbleness to a lot of the people who are writing crime fiction in Ireland, in that they seem to be able to, if you just think about the amount of time it takes to edit a book, produce the book, get it out, and all of that, even with all the time that's involved between writing the thing and it being in a reader's hands, they're always so timely, I'm finding, in the last few years in particular. And then, I mean, most recently, Catherine Ryan Howard's, book, which is set during the lockdown. This, sort of tying into what Neil is saying about, there being a sense of flux and a sense of change and people curious to see where things will shake out. You've got writers who can keep pace with it all, which is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely.
Indeed. Well, I'm conscious of our time here. I see, just before we finish up, I see we have fantastically a message from Andrea Carter herself. So she writes, "Hi all, I'm loving this discussion. In answer to your question about the play titles, Elizabeth, I can't remember how I came up with the titles, but I do remember my copy editor saying, I've managed to find that IRA prisoner, but I can't find the play he wrote. So maybe I overplayed the realism card." So that's great to get a little message from
Thank
the
you,
woman
Andrea.
herself at
I
the
appreciate
end
it.
there. Maybe just to let you know that the next Border Literatures event takes place on the 19th of November at 7 p.m. Irish time, when Eugene McCabe's Death and Nightingales will be discussed. This panel will be moderated by Dr. Stephanie Lehner in conversation with Owen Flannery and Owen McNamee. But for now, I'd just like to thank the National Library of Ireland and Professor Nicholas Allen for organising tonight's event, and also thank Beth Mannion and Neil Hegarty for being such a marvellous panel. And we'll finish up there. Thanks very much for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the Border Literatures series.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liam. Just to say thank you to everyone for attending tonight. We hope you really enjoyed yourselves. It was a very interesting discussion. The National Library of Ireland would, of course, like to express a massive thank you to Andrea Carter for allowing us to discuss her fantastic work tonight. Huge thank you to our panelists, Liam, Beth and Neil. It was a very insightful and interesting discussion. We really appreciate your time and your thoughts. A reminder to everybody that this event has been recorded, so if you would like to watch it again, it will be made available on the National Library of Ireland's YouTube channel. And as Liam mentioned, our next event is on the 17th of November, and we will be discussing Death and Nightingales by Eugene McCabe. So if you'd like to join us then, you can book that through www.nli.ie. And if you have any questions, comments or feedback for us, you can always get in touch at learning@nli.ie. So thank you so much for attending. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Andrea Carter. We really appreciate it, and we hope you enjoyed tonight's event. So have a lovely evening, everyone.